I've been thinking about making a whole series of videos about Haruki Murakami, about his novels. Going through his works in a chronological order, trying as much as possible not to skip any of his major works at least, beginning with this set of two novellas that I have here, published under the condensed title Wind/Pinball. The full title of the first novella is Hear the Wind Sing. So in this video, maybe I'll talk about just that first novella, Hear the Wind Sing. Let's begin with the opening sentences, the first two sentences of this novella. And after that, I will talk about the general method of Murakami, his general style of writing. And then I will talk about one other question. How should we think about the rat, the character of the rat, who is the narrator's close friend, belongs to the same hometown. They spend some of their youth together. How should we think about that character, the rat? And I think my answer to that question would provide a clue to answers to other questions, like how should we think about Derek Hartfield, the fictional character, one of the creations of Haruki Murakami, who is presented as a major inspiration for our narrator in this little book. So the opening sentences, we read, "There is no such thing as perfect piece of writing, just as there's no such thing as a perfect despair." So the initial impression is that perfectionism, the desire for perfectionism, we are setting it aside to begin with. One of the ways in which we can start writing is by letting go of that desire. Your writing is not going to be perfect, so why not write? Just start. Indirectly, relatively indirectly, here, writing is also associated with despair. So what is writing about? What is the writing of this book? The writing of this book is in part about expressing a kind of despair that comes out of the recognition of imperfections of life, including the fact that in this life, in all of our experiences, there's nothing permanent. There's nothing that we can hold on to and keep forever. Our youth, childhood, all our experiences are transitory. So this book, we can read it as a response to recognizing that fact. Once we recognize that fact, there's a mood of sadness that lingers. That attitude about what is gone and what is in the process of being lost. While we are having these experiences, we are at the same time losing them. There is another clue about how we should read these early novels. And this clue is in chapter 30. Here, the idea being discussed is being cool. What kind of person is cool? Or what kind of person appears to be cool? Quote, "There was a time when everyone wanted to be cool. Toward the end of high school, I decided to express only half of what I was really feeling. I can't recall the initial reason, but for the next several years, this was how I behaved. At which point I discovered that I had turned into a person incapable of expressing more than half of what he felt." Maybe we can read this book, Hear the Wind Sing, keeping in mind that we are reading through the perspective of a person who is not expressing or is not capable or doesn't want to express more than half of what they are feeling. So the feeling that we are reading about is being expressed incompletely or indirectly. And I think this applies more generally about Murakami's method. He has a subject matter that he wants to write for us about that subject matter. Let's say despair or the loss of youth, the loss of childhood. But for whatever reason, he doesn't want to pay direct attention to that subject matter. Instead, he pays attention to other things. He orients his attention elsewhere, other topics, other events that he's writing about. But then he leaves clues inadvertently. He leaves symbolic clues about what he's really thinking about or what is really preoccupying him. So let me give you an example. Let's get the help of an example to clarify this. Let's imagine that you are meeting your friend for dinner at a restaurant. Let's say you're meeting at 7 o'clock in the evening, 7 p.m. You arrive on time, but your friend is late. Your friend arrives at 7:15, 15 minutes late. But because you're such a good friend and such a polite friend and you want to have a positive, happy experience at this dinner with your friend, you don't want to complain about the delay, the lateness, tardiness of your friend. Instead, you try to talk about other things. You decide to talk about experience of maybe earlier in the day you were shopping and you talk about the food, the restaurant, but certain clues, without you really wanting initially, certain clues come into the content of your speech. For example, when you're talking about your shopping earlier in the day, you end up saying that you were looking for something, you're searching for an item, and you ended up searching for a long time to find that item. You couldn't find it, so you had to spend or waste a lot of time. So the loss of time, like having to wait, having to spend a lot of time, that a complaint about that enters into what you're talking about. And let's say you also complain to your friend about the waiter being late and coming to you and taking your order. That's a second complaint about time. And then later you complain about the food arriving late. Oh, why the chef is taking so much time to prepare your order. So you see, these are multiple signs, multiple clues. They're all having something to do about what is really bothering you, what is the subject matter at the core of your expressions, underneath your overt expressions. Murakami's method is quite similar to that. In this book, he's concerned with the imperfections of life, the despair that results from recognizing certain imperfections. But the idea of imperfection appear in a variety, in a multiplicity of different ways. For example, we meet a character, a female character, I think the central female character in this story, who has a missing little finger. And she also has a twin, and the difference between her and her twin is that missing finger. So we can think about those two girls, the sisters, twin sisters, as the real person and the ideal person, the imagined person. The imagined person is perfect, has no flaws. The real person has missing parts, has imperfections, faults, shortcomings. Having in mind that Murakami here is concerned with loss, the loss of youth specifically, and I think he also wants to go from having a passive relationship with the loss of youth to having an active relationship. He wants to get to a position where he can actively disown certain parts of himself, disowning his youth, disowning his childhood. So that's one of my arguments. That's one of my interpretations, the way I understand this novella, short novel. The narrator's childhood, the narrator's youth is symbolized and personified, or personated, as Carl Jung would say, is personified in the form of a character who is nicknamed as the rat. So the rat is not independent of the narrator. I think the best way to think about the rat, in my view, is to think of him as the childhood of the narrator, the youth of the narrator, and the narrator is trying to disown the rat. Calling it a rat might also be a clue. Rats are undesirable. So why do I think this way? One of the things we read about the rat is that he also tries to write novels, but there are two features about the way he writes. First, nobody ever has sex in the novels that the rat writes. The second one is nobody dies. So the absence of death and the absence of sex. Those are two features that we would typically expect in the writings of children. So there's something childlike about the way the rat tells stories. The rat is also very visceral in his expressions. It's not adult-like. He doesn't try to be sophisticated. He says, when he's displeased with something, he says, "I could puke." "I could puke" is quite childlike. And when he tries to be tough and adult-like, he says, "to be blunt," blah, 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 blah. The narrator points out for us that to be blunt is one of the rat's catchphrases. So the disowning of the rat is the disowning of the narrator's childhood. It's an act of symbolic sacrifice, a symbolic death. And because the narrator is not directly paying attention to that, Murakami is not paying direct attention to that, it shows up in the story in multiple different ways. It shows up in terms of an abortion. The female character decides to have an abortion. And it also shows up in 3 suicides that we read about in this story. So these 3 suicides, you can think about them as the echo, the after effect that represents the disowning of childhood, but their multiplicity is a sign of something being echoed. I think that's good. You can maybe complete this review by telling me what you think about Derek Hartfield, the creation of Haruki Murakami, who is presented to us as an inspiring figure for the narrator, somebody a narrator is inspired by and thinking a lot about. I have my own suspicions about what or who Derek Hartfield is, but I'm also curious to read, to hear about your interpretations. I think that's good for now. If we don't continue this discussion in video form, the next video will be about the follow-up novella, Pinball, 1973. All right, thank you very much for your attention.